The woman standing at the altar had never once been told no in her entire life. Vanessa Sterling, 28 years old, breathtakingly beautiful, dressed in a gown that cost more than most people earned in a calendar year, surveyed the man across from her, the way a collector surveys a piece of furniture. She did not choose, and does not want. He was tall, quietly built, wearing a charcoal suit that had been pressed but not recently purchased. His shoes were clean. His tie was straight. His face was calm in a way that should have communicated dignity, but which Vanessa read, instinctively and incorrectly, as resignation. She tilted her chin upward just slightly, a gesture so practiced it had become unconscious, and when the officiant began to speak, she let her gaze drift to the crystal chandeliers overhead, rather than to the face of the man she was about to marry. The guests, filling the gilded ballroom of the Sterling estate, watched in silence, some out of respect, most out of curiosity. And then, in a voice pitched just loud enough to travel, Vanessa said what she had been rehearsing since the moment her father told her the arrangement. "Don't think for one second that this marriage makes you part of my family." The room went still. Then came the laughter, polished, practiced, the kind that fills a room without warmth. Every person in that ballroom laughed, except for one. The groom. Ethan Cole stood at the altar and did not flinch, did not redden, did not look away. He simply waited for the laughter to pass, the way a man waits for rain. Vanessa Sterling had grown up understanding, as a kind of gravity, that she occupied a different tier of existence than most people. The Sterling name was not merely a surname, it was a credential, a brand, a fortress. Her father, Richard Sterling, had built Sterling Group from a regional construction firm into a diversified conglomerate touching real estate, private equity, and high-end hospitality. Vanessa had been raised in the penthouse of that fortress, educated at schools where tuition was a private matter, and connections were the real curriculum, and groomed from early adolescence for the role of eventual inheritor, not just of wealth but of standing. She was, by every measurable account, spectacular. Her beauty was the kind that photographers described as architectural clean lines, sharp bones, a quality of seeming lit from within, even in bad lighting. She dressed with precision. She spoke with authority. She knew which fork to use at a 12-course dinner and which politicians her father's donations had helped elect. She had dated men from prominent families, had been photographed at charity galas in 3 countries, and had never once wondered whether her confidence was earned or simply inherited. The idea that she might one day be told to marry a man she had not chosen, a man who arrived at her family's home in a reliable but unimpressive sedan, a man about whom her father's assistant could say only that he was financially sound and comes highly recommended by certain parties, was the kind of idea that belonged in a different woman's story. And yet there she was, in her father's study, on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, being told exactly that. Richard Sterling had not called her in to ask her opinion. He had called her in because he needed her to understand the severity of what was happening, and because Vanessa, for all her confidence, still loved her father in the unguarded way that daughters sometimes do, even when they would rather not admit it. He sat behind his mahogany desk, looking older than she had ever seen him look, the bourbon on his right untouched, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been lying to himself for several months and has finally run out of road. The numbers were not good. Sterling Group had overextended during an aggressive acquisition period, had taken on debt at rates that looked manageable in projections and catastrophic in practice, and had recently lost 2 anchor contracts to a rival firm whose CEO happened to be the brother-in-law of their largest creditor. The banks were not panicking yet, but they were asking questions in the particular careful way that signaled their patience was finite. Richard needed capital, and he needed the appearance of stability, and the man named Ethan Cole had offered both, not loudly, not with conditions attached to a document, but quietly, through an intermediary, with the kind of calm certainty that Richard had not heard in a very long time. Vanessa had listened to all of this, and had then said, with the precision of someone making a diagnosis, "You want me to marry a stranger, to save your company." Richard had not denied it. What he said instead was, "He is not dangerous. He is not cruel, and this family needs this right now." It was the most honest sentence he had spoken to her in years, and it made her angrier than anything else he could have said, because honesty from a parent, in a moment like that, has a way of sealing doors that anger might otherwise have pushed open. Ethan Cole appeared at the Sterling estate for the first time on a Friday evening. 2 weeks before the wedding date, Richard had already confirmed without consulting Vanessa. He arrived without a driver, without an assistant, without anything except a bottle of wine that Vanessa's mother, Gloria, later admitted was actually quite good. He was quieter than Vanessa had expected. Not shy, she knew shy. Had catalogued its symptoms in the men she had met who were intimidated by her, but genuinely, almost deliberately, still. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not name-drop, did not lean forward with practiced interest, did not perform the conversational gymnastics that Vanessa associated with men trying to make a favorable impression in a room where the stakes were high. He answered direct questions with direct answers, and asked questions in return that suggested he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. It should have been disarming. Instead, Vanessa found it infuriating. A man trying to win her over she could have deflected with ease. A man who simply existed in her presence, calm and undemonstrative, with no apparent need for her approval, gave her nothing to push against. She spent most of that dinner looking for the performance, the angle, the hustle she was certain was underneath the stillness. She did not find it. What she found instead was a man who helped clear the soup bowls without being asked, who spoke to the household staff without the slight condescension most of her father's guests could not entirely suppress. And who, when Gloria asked what he did for a living, said simply, "Investments," and then changed the subject by asking Gloria about the framed photograph on the credenza, which turned out to have been taken in Portugal in the early 1990s, and which led to 20 minutes of Gloria describing a trip she had clearly not thought about in years, but was delighted to revisit. After he left, Gloria said, "I like him." Vanessa had gone to bed in a fury she could not fully explain, which was somehow worse than a fury she could. The wedding took place on a Saturday in December, with 400 guests, a florist who had done 3 royal events in Europe, and a bride who wore an expression of such composed hostility that more than one guest mistook it for nerves. Ethan stood at the altar in his pressed suit and waited. When the vows were exchanged by a justice of the peace, not a religious ceremony, because Vanessa had refused to stand in a church for this, Ethan said his clearly and without hesitation. Vanessa said hers in a tone that would have read as mechanical to anyone paying close attention, which most guests were too polite to admit they were. The reception that followed was technically flawless and emotionally arctic. Vanessa moved through it as though conducting an audit, accepting congratulations with a smile that reached her cheekbones but not her eyes, while Ethan remained at the periphery of whatever conversation he found himself in, pleasant but not gregarious, present but never performing. When someone asked him what he thought of the Sterling estate, he said it was a beautiful home. When someone asked whether he played golf, the activity through which a significant portion of Richard Sterling's relationships were maintained, he said he did not but was willing to learn. This answer produced a kind of polite bafflement in the asker that Vanessa, watching from across the room, noticed and filed away. A man who was as financially negligible as her father's discreet summary had suggested should have been working harder than this to fit in. The fact that he was not either meant he was stupid, which he clearly was not, or that he had reasons she did not yet understand for not feeling the need to. The rules began the morning after. Vanessa had thought about them on the flight from the reception venue to the apartment she now technically shared with Ethan, a penthouse that had been her own for 3 years and which now had a second set of keys in someone else's pocket. She delivered them over breakfast, in a tone she might have used for a briefing with a junior associate. The master bedroom was hers. The guest suite, at the end of the hall, was his. He was not to accompany her to professional or social events without explicit prior discussion and approval, because she would not have her relationships complicated by the presence of someone she had not chosen to introduce. He was not to speak about their marriage to anyone she knew without her being present. He would not be brought to dinners with her close friends. He could use the kitchen, the gym, the car service, and the building amenities. She was not interested in being petty, but the terms of their proximity were to be governed by mutual distance until further notice. Ethan had listened to all of this the way he seemed to listen to everything, without interruption, without visible reaction. When she finished, he nodded once, said, "Understood," and went back to his coffee. The absence of argument unsettled her more than argument would have. She had expected protest or wounded pride, or the particular performing of emotion that men sometimes did when told something they did not like. She got nothing except a quiet acknowledgement, which somehow felt like a win he had refused to let her have. The first time her friends met Ethan was at a brunch 2 weeks into the marriage, which Vanessa had not planned, but which had happened because her closest friend, Madison Hale, had shown up unannounced on a Sunday morning with pastries and had encountered Ethan making coffee in the kitchen before Vanessa emerged from the master suite. Madison had looked Ethan up and down with the frank appraisal she applied to everything and had then asked, with the ease of someone who has never needed to be careful, "So what do you do exactly? Like, what's your annual income situation?" The phrasing was Madison's particular brand of socially aggressive curiosity, deployed with a smile that took some of the edge off but not all of it. Ethan had looked at her for a moment, then smiled, not the strained smile of a man hiding embarrassment, but a genuine one, as though he had found the question more interesting than offensive, and said, "Enough." Madison had laughed, uncertain whether to be charmed or annoyed, and Vanessa had walked in at that moment and interpreted the entire exchange through the lens of everything she had already decided about Ethan. She took Madison to the living room, closed the kitchen door, and spent the next 40 minutes talking about how surreal it was to be in this situation, how temporary she intended it to be, how Ethan was basically a very expensive inconvenience that her father had arranged, and that she intended to manage as cleanly as possible. Madison had nodded and said absolutely and 100%, and had glanced at the closed kitchen door twice, in a way that Vanessa chose not to notice. Later, at a dinner party hosted by another friend, when someone asked about the new husband, and someone else asked how much he made, and someone else made a joke about kept men and the trajectory of marrying down, Vanessa had laughed along with the general sentiment rather than ending the conversation, which would have been the more generous choice, and which she did not make. Ethan was not at that dinner. He had not been invited. He had spent that evening reading in the guest suite, and when Vanessa came home at midnight, his light was off, and the apartment was quiet. And she had gone to bed feeling victorious in a way that, even then, had a faint sourness to it. She could not quite place. The first sign that something did not add up appeared on an ordinary Wednesday. Vanessa had come home early from a meeting that had been rescheduled, and she had heard Ethan's voice from his room, low, precise, carrying the specific cadence of someone who was not making small talk. She had not meant to listen. She had paused in the hallway because the register of his voice was different from anything she had heard from him in 6 weeks of cohabitation, and because the words she caught before she made herself walk on had not sounded like the words of a man who did investments in the vague way he had described to her mother. The phrase she caught was, "Tell the Singapore team to hold until I confirm with Zurich." This could have meant anything. It probably meant something. She told herself it meant nothing and kept walking. The second sign was harder to dismiss. She had been dropping off dry cleaning at a service her building used, a nondescript place on the ground floor that she walked through without looking up, and she had seen Ethan through the glass of the building's side entrance in conversation with 2 men in suits, whose body language communicated, with remarkable clarity, deference, not the polite attentiveness of business associates, deference, the slight forward lean, the hands held still, the eyes tracking Ethan's face with an attention that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with hierarchy. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds before she moved on. But she found herself thinking about it that evening, in a way she did not want to. The third sign was a car. On a Thursday morning she had seen, from her office window, a black vehicle idling at the curb below, not a sedan, not a hired car, but something that her eye had registered with the instinctive class consciousness she had been trained to since childhood as belonging to the category of vehicle that people used when they wanted to arrive somewhere without being noticed but had budgets that made anonymity technically impossible. Ethan had emerged from the building's side entrance, said something brief to the driver, and gotten in. The car had pulled into traffic with the particular unhurried confidence of something that does not need to hurry. Vanessa had stood at her window for a long moment after it disappeared. The Sterling Group's troubles did not announce themselves publicly all at once. They began instead as a series of small contractions, a contract delayed here, a financing round that stalled there, a story in a business publication that was framed as a profile but read, to anyone with industry knowledge as an early warning signal. Vanessa had been peripherally aware of the stress for months. The way you are aware of a sound in the walls that you tell yourself is the building settling. It was only in the last week of February, when she arrived at her father's office for what was supposed to be a routine quarterly update, and found Richard sitting at his desk, staring at a printout with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up a state of undress, that, in the context of her father's meticulousness, communicated crisis more accurately than any document, that the full shape of the problem became clear. Sterling Group had lost its two largest hospitality contracts to a competitor that had, through a combination of aggressive pricing and what Richard described through tight lips as irregular intelligence about our bid structure, undercut them at the exact threshold that would make their projected revenue impossible to meet. The bank was no longer asking questions politely. A board member had begun making calls that were not reported to Richard until after they happened. And there was a shortfall, a number Richard wrote on a piece of paper and slid across the desk to her without speaking, that was large enough to register as catastrophic even to Vanessa, who had always moved through financial discussions with the abstract comfort of someone who had never personally felt money run out. She looked at the number. She looked at her father. He looked like a man who had been awake for several consecutive nights, which he had. Vanessa felt, for the first time in her adult life, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of standing on ground that might not hold. When she got home that evening, Ethan was in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and said, without preamble, because she was shaken, and because shaken people sometimes say more than they intend to. Sterling Group might be in serious trouble. Ethan turned from the counter. His expression was attentive in the way it always was. He said, "I know." She waited for more. What came next was something she had not anticipated. "I can help." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, because she was afraid and fear in her had always manifested as contempt. "What could you possibly do?" "You're a man who does investments." She said the word in a way that made it sound like a child playing with toy trucks. "You don't have the kind of money we're talking about, Ethan. Nobody in your world does." Ethan nodded slowly, as though she had said something that required a moment to absorb. Then he said, "All right." And he turned back to the counter. The trader inside Sterling Group was a man named Douglas Park, Senior Vice President of Business Development, 17-year employee, godfather to Richard's youngest grandchild. He had been passing bid intelligence to the competitor for 11 months, motivated by a combination of a private financial arrangement and a long-standing grievance about a promotion he believed he had been passed over for unfairly. Vanessa discovered it not through any official investigation, but through a conversation she overheard in the parking garage of the company's downtown office, a fragment of a call that Douglas had taken on his cell phone with insufficient awareness of acoustics. She had stood behind a concrete pillar, not breathing, and listened to him describe her father's next financing timeline to someone whose voice she could not hear. She confronted him in the hallway outside the elevator bank, and she saw, in the half-second before he composed himself, the specific look of a person whose calculation has failed. He said it was not what it sounded like. She said nothing. She went directly to her father's office. Richard heard her out, then sat for a very long time in his chair without speaking. The betrayal by someone trusted, present at family events, held in genuine personal regard, seemed to hit him in a place beyond the professional damage, which was already severe. That night, Richard Sterling had a minor cardiac episode at his home and was taken to the hospital. The doctor used words like stress-induced and precautionary monitoring, and he's going to be fine. And Vanessa sat in the corridor outside her father's room, in a chair that was designed for waiting and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, completely alone. It was past midnight when she became aware of someone settling into the chair beside her. She looked up. Ethan had his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine down the hall, the kind that came in paper cups and tasted like hot disappointment, which under different circumstances Vanessa would have refused. He held one out. She took it. They sat in silence for a while, and Vanessa thought about how she had, for months, worked to ensure that this man remained at the margins of her life, and here he was at its center on the worst night she could remember, and she had not called him, and he had come anyway. She thought about saying something. She said nothing. But she did not tell him to leave. She found the document by accident. She had been looking for a phone charger in the common area of the apartment. Hers had stopped working, and she had assumed there might be a spare in the drawer of the console table near the entrance, the kind of drawer that accumulates the miscellaneous detritus of shared living. What she found instead was a folder. Ordinary looking. The kind that could have come from any office supply store. Containing a single printed page. She should have put it back. She read it. The document was a summary brief, dense, formatted in the clean, compressed style of something produced for internal distribution, rather than external presentation of the annual performance of the Cole Investment Group. The figure at the top of the page represented total assets under management. She read it twice. Then she looked at the name again. Ethan James Cole, chairman. The figure, expressed in a number with enough zeros that she had to count them, was not the portfolio of a man who did investments in the vague way she had assumed. It was a number that belonged to a category of wealth she had always known existed, but had never personally encountered. The kind that does not need to advertise itself, that moves quietly behind more visible fortunes, that does not attend industry galas, because it does not need the credibility galas confer. Vanessa set the document down on the console table and stood in the hallway of her own apartment and experienced something she could not immediately name. It was not precisely shock. Shock implies a gap between expectation and reality that collapses suddenly. And for Vanessa, the collapse was not sudden. She had been noticing the signs for weeks, had been choosing not to follow them. It was something more like vertigo. The ground had not moved. She had simply been standing on it wrong. She hired an investigator the following week. Not because she doubted what the document said. She was intelligent enough to recognize that a figure like that does not appear on a forgery, but because she needed the full shape of what she had been missing, needed to understand the dimensions of her own blindness. The investigator's report came back in 4 days, which was fast, which was itself informative because the information was not buried or obscured or difficult to find. It was simply something Vanessa had never thought to look for, because she had made her assessment on the morning of the wedding and had spent every subsequent moment reinforcing rather than questioning it. Ethan Cole was not a minor investor who had come into some money. He was the principal architect of a private investment vehicle that had, over the preceding decade and a half, quietly accumulated stakes in enterprises across 8 countries. He sat on no public boards, attended no industry conferences, appeared in no features in business publications, this by deliberate choice. The investigator's report noted, with the particular emphasis that suggested this was the part that required a second reading. He had built something extraordinary, and had then built, around that extraordinary thing, a structure of deliberate invisibility. He paid taxes, he complied with disclosure requirements. He simply had no interest in the social performance of wealth, in the rituals of display and comparison and dominance that people with money often used it for. His net worth was a number that, when Vanessa finally wrote it out on a piece of paper in her own handwriting, exceeded the entire estimated worth of the Sterling Group at its peak by a factor that made her feel slightly ill. She sat with that piece of paper for a long time. Then she thought about every occasion on which she had said something contemptuous to a man who could, at any point, have purchased her family's company as a rounding error on a quarterly report. She thought about the tone of voice she had used. She thought about the rules she had laid out over breakfast on the morning after their wedding, the way she had said the word investments as though it were a minor embarrassment. She thought about the laughter at the altar. She folded the paper precisely in half and placed it in the back of her desk drawer and sat for a very long time doing nothing. She confronted him on a Sunday evening. He was at the kitchen table reading, which he often was in the evenings, not on a screen but an actual book. A detail that she had initially interpreted as performative and had long since stopped thinking about. She sat down across from him and put the investigator's summary on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not look surprised, which she had expected. What she had not expected was that he looked, very briefly, tired. Not angry, not vindicated, not quietly triumphant in the way she would have been if the situation had been reversed. Just tired. She said, "Why?" He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Because I wanted to be known before I was recognized. There's a difference." She thought about this for a while. Then she said, "You let me humiliate you." He looked at her steadily. "I let you reveal yourself," he said. "There's a difference there, too." She wanted to argue with this. She found that she could not. What she said instead, after a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of acknowledgement, was, "I owe you more than an apology." He said, "You owe me honesty. The rest is negotiable." She did not know how to receive that kind of grace from someone she had treated as a convenience. So she did what she often did when she did not know how to receive something. She looked away, but she did not leave the table. The morning she finally said the words clearly, without preamble, without softening them into something easier. She had been awake since 4 in the morning working on how to say them in a way that communicated their actual weight rather than their social function. An apology, she had come to understand by then, can be performed with technical correctness and deliver almost nothing. She did not want to perform one. She found Ethan in the kitchen at 7, as she usually did, and she stood in the doorway and said, "I treated you as though your worth was something I could calculate at a glance, and I was wrong about the calculation, but I would have been wrong even if I had been right, because no one's worth is a number, and I knew that in the abstract, but behaved as though I didn't. I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." It was not the immediate absolution she had, somewhere under the dignity, hoped for, but it was real, and she had learned, by then, to prefer real things over comfortable ones. Over the following days, the people who had laughed at the altar and mocked Ethan at dinner parties and asked, in the particular tone of people who believe their frankness is a social gift, what his income situation was. Those people had begun, as information about Ethan's actual position quietly circulated through the networks that run on such information, to recalibrate. The recalibration was not subtle. Madison Hale texted Vanessa to say she had always suspected there was more to Ethan than met the eye, which was not true, and which they both knew was not true. People who had declined to include Ethan in their guest lists were suddenly mentioning events at which he would be most welcome. Ethan moved through this revised landscape with the same equanimity he had brought to the original one. He did not take the calls from people who had ignored him. He was not cold, but he was not available. Vanessa watched this and understood something she had not previously understood, or rather had understood theoretically but not from the inside, that the most powerful position you can occupy is one where other people's opinions of you are genuinely irrelevant to your sense of yourself. She had thought, all her life, that she occupied that position. She had not. Ethan did. Sterling Group's situation reached its terminus on a Thursday morning in March, when the bank formally triggered a clause that accelerated the repayment timeline, and several board members, who had until that point maintained at least the posture of confidence, made it clear in rapid succession that they were prepared to recommend dissolution rather than restructuring. Richard Sterling sat in a boardroom with his lawyers and looked at the faces around him and understood that the company his father had started and that he had spent 4 decades expanding was, absent an immediate and substantial capital infusion, going to cease to exist in its current form within 60 days. The employees, not the board members, not the lawyers, not the executives with their severance packages and their next roles already being quietly arranged, the employees, 4,800 of them in 12 offices across 7 states, were the people Richard was thinking about when Ethan walked into that boardroom unannounced at 11:45 in the morning, acknowledged Richard with a brief nod, set a folder on the table, and sat down. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Ethan had not dressed differently for this meeting than he dressed for any other occasion. He was in the same kind of quietly maintained but unremarkable clothes he always wore. He did not introduce himself to everyone in the room, because the people in the room who mattered already knew who he was, and the ones who did not found out within approximately 90 seconds, when his legal team, 3 people who had been waiting in the building lobby, entered behind him with documents that had clearly been prepared with considerable legal precision over a not insignificant period of time. The terms he put on the table were fair, not lenient fare. He was not rescuing Sterling Group as an act of charity, and the structure of the offer made this clear. He was restructuring it as an investment, with conditions attached to governance and oversight that would constrain Richard's autonomy in ways that would take some adjustment. But the company would survive. The employees would keep their jobs. The name would continue, because Ethan had decided, for reasons he did not explain in that boardroom, that the name was worth preserving. Richard Sterling looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at the man across the table who was married to his daughter, and who had spent 6 months being treated in his home and at his table as something between an inconvenience and a charity case, and whose patience and discretion under those conditions now struck Richard as representing a quality of character he was not certain he himself possessed. He signed. The conversation between Richard and Ethan that happened later, in Richard's office, after the lawyers had gone, lasted 2 hours. Vanessa was not present for most of it. What she knew of it, she learned partly from her father, who described it with the careful understatement of a man recounting something he is still processing, and partly from Ethan, who mentioned it once and only once, briefly, without drama. Richard had apologized, not for the marriage arrangement itself, which had been made under circumstances that he believed had given him little choice, but for the manner in which it had been treated, for the ambient understanding in his household that Ethan was a lesser figure, an arrangement rather than a person, an asset being deployed rather than a man being welcomed. He said he should have spoken to Vanessa differently about it from the beginning. Ethan had accepted the apology without elaborating on the ways in which it had landed, which was, Richard told Vanessa later, somehow more dignified than anything he could have said in response. What Ethan had said, before the conversation ended, was that he had not entered the marriage with expectations about how he would be received, but that he had hoped, at some point, to be seen. That was the word he used. Seen, not for what he owned, not for what he could provide, but for the person he actually was, when no one was performing anything. Vanessa, when her father relayed this, sat with it for a long time. The change in Vanessa was not dramatic. It did not happen in a single revelatory moment. It happened in the accumulation of small choices she began making differently. The choice to stay in the room when she was tempted to leave it, the choice to ask questions she might have previously considered beneath her dignity, the choice to be honest about what she did not know, rather than covering it with the performance of certainty that she had mistaken, for most of her life, for confidence. She began spending time with Ethan in the apartment, not because she was required to, but because she found, as weeks passed, that his company was genuinely interesting, that the stillness she had once read as emptiness was in fact the opposite, a kind of interior density that you could not access from the outside because he did not offer it reflexively, but which revealed itself slowly and with a quality of substance that she had rarely encountered in the people she had surrounded herself with. He was funny, in a dry way. He was curious about things she would not have expected him to be curious about: the history of the building they lived in, the provenance of specific phrases, the mechanics of systems she took for granted. He listened differently than most people listened, not waiting, not constructing a response, but actually tracking what was being said, and occasionally asking a follow-up question that revealed he had been paying more attention than most people ever did. She began, cautiously and imperfectly, to let him see her not the Vanessa who moved through social situations with the ease of someone who had been choreographed since birth, but the one who was sometimes uncertain, sometimes frightened, sometimes genuinely unsure of the right thing to do, and honest enough, now, to say so. He received this without making a production of it. One evening, several months after the boardroom meeting, she asked him directly why he had stayed through the early rules, through the public humiliations, through 6 months of being managed rather than regarded. He thought about it for a while, the way he thought about things. And then he said, "Because I had made a decision. And I don't leave decisions because they get uncomfortable, and because I thought you were worth knowing, if you ever decided to be knowable." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That's either very patient or very stubborn." He said, "Usually both." There was a dinner, 2 weeks after the restructuring was finalized, to which Vanessa invited a small number of people, not the sprawling network of her social life, but 8 people who actually mattered to her in the particular way that became clear once you stopped maintaining relationships primarily for their utility. Ethan was there not as the quiet figure at the margins, but at the center of the table. And the conversation that night was the kind that stays with people, wide-ranging, honest, occasionally uncomfortable in the way that honest conversations are when people are not performing anything. At one point, someone asked Ethan how he thought about the relationship between money and happiness, which was the kind of question people ask at dinner when the money in question is large enough to seem like a different currency than the kind you use for groceries. Ethan said, without particular weight, that he had spent a significant portion of his adult life ensuring that money was never the thing he had to think about, specifically so that it would not become the thing he thought about most. He said that the men he had encountered who thought about it most were almost uniformly the ones who had the most. There was a silence after this. And then someone laughed genuinely, not politely. And the conversation moved on. Vanessa, across the table, watched him and thought about the woman who had stood at an altar and said the things she had said, and felt the familiar pull of shame, and then, for the first time, cleanly let it go, not because it had not happened, because holding on to it served nothing except her own ongoing narrative of herself as someone who had been wrong. And she was tired of that being the most important thing about that day. What had happened since was also part of that day. The choice to be different was also part of that day. She looked at Ethan, and he looked at her at precisely that moment, across the table. And he smiled, not the politely managed expression of a man who had made peace with a difficult situation, but the unguarded, unperforming smile of someone who is simply glad to be where they are. She smiled back. It was not complicated. That was the part that surprised her most, how uncomplicated it finally was, once she stopped making it otherwise. Vanessa did not give a speech. She had thought about it, had considered finding some public forum in which to account for herself, and had eventually concluded that the accounting that mattered had already happened privately, and that performing it publicly would be a way of making her own redemption the story, which it was not. The story, if there was one worth telling, was the distance between the person you present to the world at your most offended and the person you actually are when you stop defending it. It was the fact that a man had been stood in front of a room and publicly dismissed and had responded not with retaliation or performance, but with patience, and had kept his patience through months of marginalization, and had eventually been in a position to help without condition and had helped, not to prove a point, not to be thanked, but because the people who needed help were real, and the capacity to help was available. And that was reason enough. Vanessa thought about this often in the months that followed, about what it means to have something and not require anyone to know you have it, about the discipline involved in keeping your own counsel, when every social context is constructed to reward display, about the particular courage of a man who had walked into a room where he was openly unwanted and had neither protested nor performed, but had simply been, with remarkable consistency, himself. She had grown up believing that power was something you projected outward, that the clearest sign of strength was the visibility of it. Ethan had shown her, without ever trying to show her anything, that the opposite was true, that the strongest position is the one you hold so securely you do not need anyone to see you holding it. She thought, too, about what she had nearly forfeited, for months, through the particular arrogance of a woman so accustomed to being right in small ways that she had not noticed she could be catastrophically wrong in large ones. The people she had laughed with, the tone she had permitted and sometimes led, the way she had looked past someone and mistaken the absence of display for the absence of substance. On a morning in June, Vanessa stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the apartment, her apartment, once, and now, in the fuller sense, theirs, and watched the city below with the particular quiet of someone who has recently rearranged a significant piece of how they understand the world and is still measuring the effects. Ethan came to stand beside her with coffee, the real kind, not the vending machine variety, though she thought about that cup too sometimes. He did not say anything. He rarely did. In the mornings, she looked at his reflection in the glass, the man who had stood at an altar in a pressed suit while the room laughed, who had endured 6 months of careful exclusion without complaint, who had watched his wife grow slowly toward honesty, at a pace dictated by her own schedule, and had offered no pressure in any direction, and she thought, as she thought with increasing frequency, that he had been right, not about the things she had told herself he was wrong about the things that had turned out to matter. The patience, the dignity, the refusal to prove anything to anyone, not because he had nothing to prove, but because proof offered to an audience that had not earned the right to judge you is a kind of capitulation dressed as confidence. She had mistaken that refusal for weakness for months. She understood now that it was the most calibrated strength she had ever encountered. The strength of a person who knows, without requiring anyone to confirm it, who they are and what they are worth. and who extends courtesy even to those who have not extended it to them, not from naivety, but from a settled understanding that dignity is not contingent on reciprocity. Outside, the city moved in its indifferent way, enormous and continuous, full of people making their calculations and revising them, measuring each other against scales they had inherited or constructed or never thought to question. Inside, in the quiet, Vanessa held her coffee with both hands and understood, for the first time without the casing of performance around it, that the most significant inheritance her father had ever given her was not the name or the address or the education or the connections. It was the specific accident of an arrangement that had placed, in the spare room at the end of her hallway, a man she had not chosen and had not wanted and had spent months refusing to see, and who had waited, with a patience she was still not certain she deserved, for her to finally look. The richest person in any room is not always the one with the largest number in an account somewhere. Sometimes it is the person who arrives without needing to announce what they bring, who stays without requiring acknowledgement of their staying, who gives without needing the gift to be named, and who forgives not because it costs them nothing, but because they have decided, quietly and without ceremony, that it is the right thing to do. Ethan Cole had never needed Vanessa Sterling's approval. He had wanted, in the end, something far simpler and far more difficult to give. The willingness to be present without armor, to admit error without negotiating it into something smaller, to meet another person not as a category but as an individual. She had finally managed it. It had taken longer than it should have. It had taken public humiliation she had inflicted, and a crisis she had watched from the outside, and a slow accumulation of evidence she had resisted before accepting. But she had managed it. And on the morning she finally understood this, clearly understood it not as a lesson about judgment or class or assumption, though it was all of those things, she set her coffee down and turned to the man beside her and said, very simply, "Thank you for not leaving." He looked at her for a moment. In that particular way he had of looking at things, as if the looking itself was worth taking a moment for. Then he said, "I was never going to." It was not a romantic declaration. It was something better than that. It was a statement of character, by someone who had demonstrated it consistently, over time, under conditions that would have broken the performance of a lesser commitment. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, something that had begun as an arrangement cold and formal and built on desperation had become, through the patient accumulation of honesty, something that neither of them had started out looking for, and both of them had, in the end, been given. Do not judge the worth of a person by what they wear, or what they display, or how loudly they announce themselves, because the most remarkable thing about the man in the pressed suit standing at the altar was never what he owned. It was that he never once needed you to know it. The lesson Vanessa Sterling spent the better part of a year learning is one that most people encounter in some form, though rarely in circumstances quite this concentrated. That the categories we use to organize other people by their address, their clothes, their profession, the fluency of their social performance are not measurements of value but measurements of our own assumptions. She had been handed every advantage that a family and an education and a name could provide. And she had used those advantages, for most of her life, to construct a hierarchy in which she sat comfortably near the top. The hierarchy was real, in the sense that social hierarchies are always real in their effects, real in the way they shape behavior and confer access, and determine whose discomfort gets noticed. But it was not the only map. Ethan had been navigating by a different one the entire time, one in which what a person did in private, when no one was watching and there was nothing to gain, told you more about them than anything they might display in public. By that map, Vanessa had not been at the top of anything. She was willing to say so now. That willingness was not small. It was, in fact, the most valuable thing she had ever built, because it was entirely her own. Not inherited, not arranged, not the product of a name or a network or a family's long accumulation of standing. She had arrived at it the hard way, which is the only way that anything of real weight actually arrives. Ethan knew this. He had known it long before she did, and he had waited, with the extraordinary patience of a man who trusted the process of people becoming more fully themselves, for her to find it on her own terms, in her own time, without pressure from him. That, in the end, was the most remarkable part of all.